Good morning. I'm Dave Lubach, Executive Editor for the Facilities Market for Trade Press Media Group. Thank you for joining us in today's webcast, The Evolving ESCO Industry and Its Impact on Facility Management. Our presenter today is Dr. Timothy Unruh, Executive Director of the National Association of Energy Service Companies, or NAESCO. In his role, he manages the representation of its member energy service companies. NAESCO provides advocacy for the industry at the federal, state, and local levels, and provides member company accreditation. Prior to this role, Dr. Unruh was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Renewable Power at the Energy Efficiency and Renewable, EERE, Office of the Department of Energy. As a Deputy Assistant Secretary, Timothy managed the nation's renewable power research while also providing oversight to the Grid Modernization Initiative. Today's webcast learning objectives include learning how ESCOs have expanded to address efficiency, infrastructure resiliency, and sustainability. Discover the benefits of energy savings performance contracts, or ESPCs, and sustainability as a service, or SEAAS. See how ESCOs optimize performance, reduce maintenance, and enhance safety. Understand how ESCOs meet sustainability goals and regulatory requirements. And finally, learn how ESCOs improve asset management and streamline facility operations. But before we get started with today's event, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. First off, a special thank you to Tim and NAESCO for making this event possible. And with that, we'll start our chat with Tim. Tim, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. First off, I guess, Tim, if you could maybe tell us a little bit about how you ended up with a career in the energy service company market.
Well, oddly enough, it was somewhat accidental. It's just kind of the circumstances of your job take you there. I was an electrical engineer working for a utility company in Michigan, and they decided that they wanted to start doing energy efficiency for their clients. This was the days of deregulation. Utilities were shaking in their boots. They were afraid they were going to lose customers, and so they were trying to add on services. It's part of where the ESCO industry kind of got its start as well, as the additional services, and they developed these energy service companies. Well, my utility decided to come in and provide services to its largest client, the automotive industry. And so I was tapped to build a group to provide efficiency measures across the state of Michigan, and wound up with 21 engineers working all over the state, providing energy efficiency in an industrial automotive environment. I left that job and went to a little company in Kansas City called Custom Energy, where I became involved in the energy service company industry. And it was quite different than the industrial area, but I grew to like it. I saw how performance contracting, energy savings performance contract, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, how they work, and I was fascinated by that. I grew in the company, transitioned over to the Department of Energy at some point, and became head of the program that runs the energy efficiency for all the federal buildings and vehicles, and then wound up here at NAESCO, where I'm with you today. Imagine that.
Yeah, I know it's a very interesting path that you've taken, Tim, and I know from the time that I've started to work with you a little bit of learning a lot about the your organization's very interesting, and as hopefully everybody's going to find as well, a very beneficial organization for our facility managers. So first off, you could tell me a little bit, Tim, about exactly what an ESCO does. I think people have heard that phrase, but maybe aren't exactly as familiar with it.
Well, an ESCO is an energy service company. And there are other terms of ESCOs. Sometimes in New York State, an ESCO is a commodity supplier. But in our context, we are primarily companies that come into a building and implement improvements to the building to save money. The money we save could be energy savings. It could be operational savings. There's all different ways that we go about savings. In some cases, some of our projects even develop a revenue stream from, say, water or from renewable power generation or other sorts of activities. The ESCO is a turnkey provider that comes in and provides all the services necessary to renovate the facilities. And so often when you start the process of renovating a facility with an ESCO, you don't know the scope because you don't know what all you could do to save energy. It's not that you don't know your facility, you're not expertise. The ESCOs come in with experience and knowledge and background of people that are specifically trained to save energy and reduce costs. And so they come in and develop a scope of work that says, okay, here's all that we think we can do. And here's a proposal how this is going to work. And then the ESCO will guarantee the savings. And that's an important piece. ESCOs provide a product primarily today called energy savings performance contracts. An energy savings performance contract is something where the government allows a public building to enter into a contract where the savings covers the cost of a loan to pay for all the improvements. And why that's important is that it allows a public building, for example, to do an implementation that improves the building, improves the indoor air quality, improves the efficiency, and they don't have to have any new budget authority. So they don't have to go to voters for approval or for an outside party for approval, because the money is basically taking what you saved to pay down the recurring costs of a loan over maybe a 15 to 20 year period to make that payback work. And so the energy service company puts all that together, and they're very focused on the savings, but also focused on the cost side, because they can't let costs go too high, otherwise the savings won't cover it. And they can't let savings go too low, so they've got to really make sure they get the savings, because they have to guarantee that savings. And the guarantee is critical in that that assures that the public entity doesn't have more costs going out than what they have to make that loan payment. So they're neutral through the entire process. Energy service companies have actually expanded as we go today, and they're doing much more broad work today, as they've found that their skills and their ability to work with clients has really created a great relationship with those clients and allowed them to expand the services. We're looking at the energy as a service, which you mentioned, which is something where there's a more involved process where the energy service company might stay more involved with the client for a longer period of time. There could be some ownership transfer of the equipment. There's risk transfer or responsibility transfer. It could include operation and maintenance. Each case is somewhat unique depending on the client's needs and where the ESCO wants to go with that project. But the universe continues to expand and change as far as what the ESCOs can provide to their clients. I'll tell you what, while Dave's figuring out his mute issue, since I can't hear him, I suspect no one else can either.
Can you hear me now?
I'm just going to talk about some of the scope of work of what an ESCO does. An energy service company is a company that will come in and primarily focus on the energy consuming devices in your building. And so that includes primarily things like HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning. It can include lighting. It can include water efficiency. Sometimes the things that they work on are exterior to the building. In many cases, there could be buildings that are spending a lot of money on water, on landscaping, for example, and you could change the landscaping. It could include roofs. It could include window. Those are building envelope. There's a lot of innovative things out there. Lighting controls are some of the new areas that we see going in. But the types of scope of things that the ESCOs provide is pretty broad. When you look at the building, what the ESCO's real goal is to come in and to try to provide improvements to the overall building. It used to be, when we thought of energy efficiency, when energy efficiency was born, it was clear back in the 70s. And that's even predated for the ESCO industry. The ESCO industry was really founded in the 80s. But clear back in the 70s when it was born, we thought of energy efficiency as making it cold when we want to be warm, making it warm when we want to be cold, and making it dim when we want lights. And so we did this whole process of taking out lights and setting back thermostats. Today's energy efficiency is quite the opposite. Today, we know what the comfort standards are for a building. We know what the lighting standards are. And the energy efficiency project typically will take a building from its poor operating state to a state where they're providing and meeting all the standards. So now we have the proper light for students' desktops. We have the proper temperature that we have for the building. And now after COVID, indoor air quality is also a big deal. Other things that come up that are very important to public buildings especially is resiliency, making sure that you've got the ability to recover in case something happens and even to prevent something happens. And oddly enough, cybersecurity comes into this as well. And the ESCOs are skilled at handling all those things. Another new area, I just did a session yesterday here in Dallas where I'm at, is water and wastewater. Water and wastewater are growing in popularity, and we see a lot of opportunity to improve those as well.
So, all right, Tim. Yeah, you. Hopefully, we aren't going to be repeating here what discovered already. But a lot of times, obviously, projects like these involve money, and ESCO is involved. There's money involved, obviously, there too. Where does the money really come from in an ESCO project?
Well, that's a good question. So, the money can come from a lot of different sources. What an ESCO does is an ESCO is trying to take all the sources of money that a client has available and to build that into the project that provides the most benefit for them. So many times when you go to a client, they may have a capital fund of something that they're going to replace. So they may say, we've got money to replace the lights in the building. Well, lighting replacements are a great thing to combine with the energy savings performance contract, because you can take the savings associated with the lighting and you can apply that to help pay for other measures in the facility. That goes for anything you have. And we call that concept leveraging, because when you combine that money from a project that you're going to do anyway, or money you have from other sources, into a performance contract, you leverage the savings to get more of the project. And so $1 of savings plus $1 of capital can go in and buy more than just $2 worth of retrofits. And so that's one source. One source is the capital that you already have. Now, some clients don't have any capital, and that's very common for us to run into in a public building. It doesn't stop a project. There are other sources. There's rebates from utilities are very common as well. There's a significant amount of money for tax credits. The Inflation Reduction Act tax credits are out there and available. And although there's a lot of speculation about will those be available in the future, I can't answer that question, but I can tell you they are available now and they are being paid now, and it is working without flaw today. We've heard of many clients receiving checks and going forward with that. So it's not something to just neglect out of the fear it may not be there in the future, but it's there today. And then finally, the energy service company will make up the difference for what you don't have for the project that you need, and they'll go out and find finance for that, and they will work with you to arrange with your advisors to find how that financing works. So the ESCO can't actually do the financing or do the arrangement. They'll help you identify what it is you need to do so that you can then go talk to financiers to bring that in. And then whatever that loan payment that works out from that finance package, that then becomes what the guarantee has to cover so that they have a budget neutral project that goes forward, including the capital, the rebates, the tax credits, other sources of income, and the note payment. All of that has to be budget neutral when it all comes out and finished. So that's where the ESCOs often find the money from all over the place. And they're experts at helping you identify those and to help you understand the requirements for those and putting that together.
Yeah, we've heard also that the ESCO market is also heavily dominated in public building spaces. And why do you think that is, Tim?
Well, there's a lot of speculation. Why isn't the ESCO industry flourishing outside the public building space? A lot of it, I think, has to do with the laws that are structured around performance contracting with the public building set. The public building set, for example, is often challenged to find capital. Usually in public buildings, the money is controlled in some way, shape, or form through a public election type process, either an election of people that make that decision, or in a case of a bond issue, it could be voting for approval of a bond issue for a school district, for example. But facility improvements aren't as flashy as a new soccer field. Facility improvements aren't as flashy as maybe a new courthouse or maybe some new cars for the county or whatever it may be. And so facility retrofits are often kind of low on the priority for those types of things to pass. And so recognizing that there's a growing amount of deferred maintenance in our public buildings, back in the 80s, states and the federal government began passing laws that allowed for this exchange of savings for a note payment to allow it to happen. So the public sector market is primed for that. The private sector market has ready access to capital and doesn't have to go through some sort of a public referendum to get that capital. The challenge with the public sector market is different, though. That capital request is competing with other capital requests because there's always a limited supply of money. Nobody has all that they want. And so in the private side, there's a challenge of, does the payback for this equal the payback over here? If I'm going to use my credit line, which is a limited resource for something, maybe I should go build more plants to build X versus renovating the existing building, which has a longer payback. The problem is that the more you make that decision, the more deferred maintenance you have, and the more you build up the criticality of that in your building, and the more likely you're going to have a failure that could shut you down and be so costly that it self-justifies an immediate cash influx to replace. And so while the private sector hasn't necessarily flourished as much as the public sector, there's a significant opportunity in private sector buildings to do the same type of structure to provide that through a separate channel of financial accounting that says, this is the payback for this, and this is a budget neutral activity, and so it doesn't impact our ability to invest and grow our business.
We've also heard there are special laws that concerning surrounding ESCO work. What can you tell us about those laws?
Yeah, so the federal government was one of the pioneers in this, passing legislation back in the early 80s that provided this exchange of savings for payment of a loan. And the laws allow that a a building official, for example, not necessarily an elected official, but a building official can make a decision to move forward on these contracts. So, for example, in many cases, the contract will go before elected officials for approval, like a school board or a city council or a county supervisors, for example. But the thing that's different about it is that the laws allow for this exchange of savings as long as the laws typically say as long as it's a budget neutral process. And so the laws have gradually begun to pass through all the 50 states. And so we have all 50 states now have laws that allow some sort of structure. Some are more robust than others. Some are fairly weak, but they all have something happening across the country where there's work happening under these laws. And these laws are different in every state. So every state has implemented it in a structure that's unique to its state. So that means an energy service company has to understand all the laws of the states they work with. And so when you talk to a person that's helping you understand this process, they're often very knowledgeable about the legal structure of how this works, as well as the physical transactional structure of how you set up a deal. And the reason this is important is that every state's different. If you work in a facility in one state and cross a state line, it's different. Oddly enough, in some states, if you work for a school and you transition to a city, the rules could be different there. Or if you transition to a state, it could be different there because some states have different laws structuring state buildings versus school buildings versus city buildings.
Okay. Also, somewhere I read that ESCOs can leverage your funds. What does that mean?
Well, we talked a little bit about that earlier in the leveraging. And it really comes down to taking money you have for a project. So if you're going to do a building renovation, normally there's some money that comes out of that project as savings. Now, one would say, well, if I'm doing that, I want to just reap the savings back into my general coffer. That's great. And there's nothing wrong with that approach. But our problem we have is across our building set of existing buildings in public facilities especially, we have a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance. You'll see lighting in a poor state. You'll walk into a building, you'll sense that when you open the doors, they're either overpressurized or underpressurized in the building. So you either can't open the doors or the doors swing open from all the pressure inside. You've got indoor air quality that needs improving. And so you have so many things to do. And even with a performance contract, even with leveraging, I never really see that you have enough money to do all you really need to do. And so it's best if you think of trying to recoup that savings through a legal mechanism of the performance contract to roll that in and let that savings buy some more retrofits for your facility or some upgrade that you need that maybe you just don't have the money for. And so it might take you from renovating your building with a simple measure of lighting to adding lighting plus lighting controls. And so now you have the ability to provide more dynamic lighting control. You get more savings out of that, but also you provide a better environment for the people inside the building, improving their the workability of that building and its use.
You mentioned IAQ, Tim, and we actually have a question from Tanner from the audience. Wondering if you see a growing appetite among facility owners to bundle IAQ improvements, something like purification, into an ESCO-driven energy retrofit project.
Yes, IAQ is often something that would be driven into a project. Now remember when we add things into the project, the ESCO has to try to make some sort of a payback model. And many IAQ things are something that often can be paid for from the savings that you get because the building before the case with IAQ problems probably has other conditions that are driving up energy costs and driving up operational costs. And those could be a myriad of things. In some cases, though, IAQ can add costs. It's the same as resiliency or even cybersecurity. Some of those things can add cost to the project, and so that's where you have to have some capital to help cover those. So let's say the savings might be able to cover 60% of that. You might need to have 40% that's covered with capital. But that's still a benefit because if you didn't do it that way, you're paying 100% for the entire project.
Okay. So I'm sure there's some people in the audience here that have been listening, and again, we're welcome questions and feel free to submit those. Sounding like, hey, this sounds like a great idea to hire an ESCO. So if they decide to go that route, Tim, what are some of the first steps that they should take?
Well, there's a lot of information that's available about our industry. One of the things that we really like to see and that we're really happy with is the industry has gone from its initial days where it was a little bit of a wild west where everybody was kind of defining the terms and setting their own parameters to today where it's a pretty structured industry. And that means a lot of benefits for the clients that are looking into using these. Is the most important is repeatability. If I talk to Sam down the road and Sam did a project and it worked like this, and this, the likelihood is that I can expect my project to work in a similar fashion because there's been a bit of a standardization of how this process works. So the best thing to do is first, if you know other facility people, ask them what was their experience and how did that work. More than likely, you can come to NAESCO's website, naesco.org, or you can go to the Department of Energy's website, or you can go to the Energy Services Coalition website, or to the National Association of State Energy Officials website. They all have a compendium of data about how performance contracting works and the process. If you come to my site at naesco.org, that's where you can find companies that provide this service. And there's also a place where we have an accreditation. So we accredit companies to validate that they have a high quality reputation of doing performance contracts in a repeatable fashion over time. And we maintain that list separate from our members. That's a unique qualifier that says these might be some companies I could talk to first, and they'll help me understand that. Once you kind of have a general feeling about it, the best thing to do is to begin contacting some of those companies. Talking to a salesperson. I know you don't want to talk to a salesperson, but they bring a wealth of knowledge, and can help you understand that. The ESCO industry is a unique industry. Its next job, because we work in not a scope-driven process for selection, but in a qualifications process, because when you do these projects, you don't know the scope, since the ESCO hasn't done the analysis yet. And so the way you have to pick the person to develop the scope is through a qualifications and an evaluation of who they are and their past references. Because ESCOs are picked based upon the quality of their previous work, they have a special need to make sure that their prior work is done in a high quality fashion, and that any client you call of theirs will say they're a great company, because all it takes is 1 out of 10 to say, I would never hire them again, and you won't hire them. So they work really hard to make sure that reputation is solid and strong, and accreditation helps that process to give you some confidence in that company. So your best bet is to begin talking to a company and getting that salesperson in the door to say, how does this work? What does it happen? And talk to a few.
Okay. And as you know, Tim, facility people always have so many projects going on and so many different, pulled in a lot of different directions that maybe they don't have the time and really the knowledge to kind of follow the ESCO process through. What are some options for them to do that?
Well, that's a common case. So if you find that you want to pursue a performance contract, but you just don't have the staff or the time, or maybe it's confusing to you, there is an industry that can provide assistance. There's called an owner's representative. I would encourage you to make sure that if you look at an owner's representative, you find someone who has a history of working in the ESCO industry. Our projects, I'd like to say they're as easy as cake, but they are complicated. There's a lot of things to consider, and there is value in the experience of someone who's done it multiple times. Sometimes you may just want to go to your local engineer and say, can you have somebody watch this project? They may not understand the nuances of how a project works and could miss key components in helping you develop that. But an owner's representative is a specialized industry that is made to come alongside the owner, understands the process, has worked through the process, and is aware of all the current innovations, processes, contract, legal issues. And they advise you and help you through that process. Their involvement can be as much as you want or as little as you want, depending on how you want to scope that work out. But they become, as Department of Energy has phrased it, they call it an ally in your corner. And Department of Energy has created a whole training program that trains these people and provides structure to that. Part of the standardization process that we like to see in our industry that helps you to know when you're getting quality work done.
Someone also kind of mentioned that sometimes they hear the savings are hard to guarantee. Is that so?
Well, some would think that, but let's think about the savings a little bit. The ways that we get savings is, let's take the easiest one to understand is lighting. Lighting is always the one people want to use because it's very straightforward. If I take a lamp that uses 100 watts of energy and I replace it with a lamp that uses 15 watts of energy, those are pretty solid numbers. Those don't vary or fluctuate over time. My only variable is how long is the lamp turned on. And if I know how long it turns on, then I can pretty much say that the savings is pretty solid. And so what an ESCO does for that, for example, is they put in lighting sensors that measure how many people are in this, measure when people are in the space and how long the light stays on and off. And so if you know when people are there and how long the light stays on and off, you can determine that maybe the lights are left on way longer than they should. And here's what the reduction should be. And you have that from actual measured data. Go to something more complex like a chiller, a boiler, a rooftop, or even more complex of a control system. Those types of savings you validate by looking at the end use equipment to determine how it's operating. So a chiller, for example, has a certain performance curve. And you know that if you follow that curve and the equipment is maintained and ran properly, it will follow the manufacturer's performance curve that you know you're getting a certain output based on an energy input. Now, what an ESCO strives to do is not come in and tell you how to run your building and limit your use of the building. When we have public buildings, they have a lot of dynamic uses. School buildings, especially, might have a whole night program that they decide to establish. Well, that doesn't invalidate the savings. That just means that you're going to use the equipment that was installed longer, and your bill would have been higher, but it's lower because you're following that equipment's performance curve. And so the ESCO focuses on maintaining the equipment performance curve and measuring the equipment performance curve to ensure that the savings continues to perform. In control systems, it's making sure that the overrides never happen. If the control system is set up right, we have the calculation ability and the models to calculate how energy is used in the building. Those are very sophisticated and very old, and we know how those work. It's when people get involved and begin to change things. People change the control systems and we lose the savings. People may not maintain the boiler and we lose the savings, or maintain the chiller and we lose the savings. And so it becomes a process to validate the savings of making sure that things are being done like they're supposed to be done. And that becomes a big part of the process, as well as putting in measurement devices to measure the equipment performance and how it's operating.
Okay. This all sounds great, and you kind of wonder why maybe somebody wouldn't pursue an ESCO. I guess the question would be like, why doesn't everybody pursue an ESCO contract?
Well, because the process is different, we're kind of the oddball on the block in that people do a lot of purchasing and a lot of building improvements through a classic process of design, bid, build, or design, build process. And they're pretty comfortable with that. And along comes this newfangled process. And maybe I have some buddy down the street who heard something from her friends, cousins, aunts, uncle that there is a problem with these. But we don't know what the problem is. And so there's a lot of innuendo that maybe these don't work. And it's because they're different and new. Oddly enough, they're no longer new. We've been around now for 40-some years. But there's still a bit of apprehension that it's just too good to be true. And sometimes when something seems too good to be true, people try to find kinks in the armor or problems. But we have a history of doing somewhere between $7 and $10 billion a year now. There's a significant amount of this. Our largest market is K-12 schools, followed by federal government, and then state and local buildings. So there's a significant amount of business happening in this, and more people are coming onto this and recognizing the value of this. And so we're beginning to dispel some of those old stories that have existed for decades now. But the reality is the projects perform very well, but sometimes that too good to be true just causes people to be a little hesitant and a little unsure. And it does take a team to put these together. You need to have somebody from legal in there. You need to have somebody from your bookkeeping, your financial area in there, and facilities has to be in there. And so it takes a whole team to put this together. It's not just something where you get a scope of work and you go build it and then the contractor walks away. This is something you stay with for many, many years to ensure performance over 10 to 15 to 20 years.
We've mentioned a little bit here in there, Tim, about a performance period. So could you talk a little bit about what the performance period of an ESCO contract entails?
Yeah, the performance period is that part after construction. So normally in a construction project, you have a 1-year warranty is what you get in normal construction, plus any extended warranties you had, or maybe any ongoing maintenance that you purchased as well. For a performance contract, you have a performance period that means after construction, we have to validate and ensure that the performance continues to work. remember that reputation and that reference thing I talked about earlier? That's part of that. So imagine if you have to have a client that you own for 15 years, and you have to make sure that they're always happy for that 15 years with a project that was installed a long time ago, maybe even a project that was installed under your predecessor. They still want you to be happy with that project because they want to use you as a reference for the next project. And so the performance period is the period where you're using the equipment, and then you have an agreement that may say there's a certain amount of maintenance that has to be done. You have to operate it in a certain fashion. There could be extended warranties in there. There may not be, but all that has to be managed. And then finally, that guarantee has to be managed to make sure that the savings continues to be produced by the installation. That's the performance period.
Okay, thank you. And also, it may seem like an ESCO market might have a termination soon, as we have so many buildings that are being retrofitted. Can you explain a little bit about that?
It's an interesting phenomenon. The ESCO industry really got its start on lighting retrofits. That became when we came out with high efficiency fluorescent lamps. We went from T12 to T5s. There was a tremendous amount of savings that drove a lot of project renovations. And that started the pay for savings type of approach. As those lighting retrofits started to die off, we saw HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, coming in, and we saw benefits in reduced consumption of chillers and boilers. Control systems came in, and so new technology began to drive that process. And then lighting went from the high efficiency fluorescents down to LEDs. And oddly enough, now we've gone from LEDs to higher efficiency LEDs. And the challenge that people say is, well, your savings is getting smaller and smaller, and perhaps the project just isn't going to work anymore. That could be the case, but the ESCO industry continues to find ways to develop savings for a site that improves the overall operation. We've actually noticed through Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, the study that the projects are getting larger over time, and that the industry continues to grow, not shrink. And so we see anywhere from an 8 to a 12% growth rate each year still happening in the industry. And so what that means is that you're still seeing innovation in the way things operate, the types of measures you can do, and the types of ways you can combine existing money, rebate money, tax credit money into a project that makes the project more beneficial to the client. So it's not dying yet. Perhaps it's going to someday, but we don't see anything where it's dropping off right now. We actually see it growing.
Okay. And this is a final question I have for Tim. And then again, we also want to let the audience know, please feel free to submit your questions for Tim, and we will get to those as time allows. So last question here that I had from our questions here, Tim. Why should a facility owner consider an ESCO approach versus just a normal project?
Well, I'll tell you, the ESCO approach is one where you're forming a partnership with this company. I know we all like to banter around this whole term, public-private partnership, P3. I hear it all the time. But the reality is it's often focused on a scope of work and things that you're going to accomplish. And it de-emphasizes the fact that there's a partnership that happens. And so your relationship becomes more partner-like and less contractor-owner-like. And when you work with an energy service company, it allows you to really work with them to get the things you need. If certain types of equipment work better for your facility, maybe your maintenance people understand it, it may be better to spend a little bit more on the project and get that equipment put in versus maybe the lowest bid item, which may cause you problems going down the line in operation. It looks at a project from a holistic life cycle approach as opposed to first cost approach. It's an odd case we have in the way we procure things. We often think of low bid is the best way to go. And so we press for low bid and we press on price, but that price is often the first cost. And while we often have to consider that, we're supposed to do a lowest evaluated bid, that first cost price just drives the decision so many times. In the ESCO project, they really can't focus on first cost price. They have to focus on what is the thing that's going to produce the best operating conditions for the facility over the next 15 or 20 years. And so when you look at an ESCO project, that is the approach you're looking at, as opposed to what is the thing that will accomplish the goal today and satisfy us today. We're looking at what will accomplish the goal today and tomorrow and 15 years out and maybe even 20 years out. And that creates a different mindset for the facility, creates a different mindset for the contractor, and that causes a relationship to be born. When you're working with an ESCO, you need to be very comfortable with calling and saying, we've got this problem, can you help us? Because they will be there, and they will be there by your side to help you, because it's their project too over that period of time. When you look at it, when you look at the ESCO project and we see testimonials from clients, one of the things that we hear more and more is the clients are saying how much they like the relationship that they have with their contractor, and they want to do repeat business. And we're seeing growing numbers of repeat business because of that relationship. It allows people to work together more fluidly, and it allows people to actually make a project that benefits both sides, not just one or the other.
Okay. All right, Tim. Well, thank you for this great information. And as I said, we're going to open this up to the audience here for your questions here, as we have a little bit of time left here. First off, another question from Tanner. So with new standards like ASHRAE 241 and well building guidelines that are gaining traction, are ESCOs adapting their strategies to proactively address air quality compliance and facility management?
Yeah, it's a great question, Tanner. I have found that ESCOs are growing in their knowledge of all these different standards. ASHRAE standards have been something that the ESCOs have been very closely for many years. But the ESCO, the engineer that does that audit, not only brings in their own expertise on this, but they'll bring in the expertise of all their contractors. One of the things about the ESCO that's interesting is they really don't necessarily have to know everything about everything, but they have to know someone who does. And so they bring in these different people and they build this team to address the things that they don't necessarily have the information on. But the basic things like the well building, the ASHRAE standards, most of the ESCO engineers are pretty well up on that and can include that in the project analysis.
Okay. A couple questions about availability of ESCOs. Obviously, we've talked a lot about what's in the United States, but internationally and Canada and other parts of North America, are there ESCO opportunities available there?
There are. About a third of my members are international companies that do work all over the globe. I have done ESCO webinars for other countries like India, in Asia, through Europe. And currently, NAESCO is a member of something called the Global ESCO Network. The Global ESCO Network is an association of associations. So it's all the ESCO associations across the globe are members of this. Oddly enough, they're having their second annual conference in Turkey in May this year. But the international aspects is the laws and structure, just like they're different in all 50 states of the U.S. and every country across the globe, the work is done in a different format, mainly because they have different laws, but also because there's different climates that require a different approach to the projects. But yes, it is an international phenomenon. Interesting enough, there was a webinar that the Global ESCO Network did this morning at 7 a.m. Eastern on the ESCO market in the Philippines.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Yeah, a few more questions here. One, James is asking about savings versus baseline, and how can owners clean up their project baseline on their own dime before the ESCOs can establish a baseline in their contract?
Well, I'm assuming cleaning up means trying to understand what you're using and to see if there's any just silly things happening that don't require capital. Certainly that can be the case. And you could go through and do an analysis of look at your control system operation logs, or you could look at your own utility analysis and try to understand consumption. I found often a facility manager, they're often time constrained and they run into trouble doing this. Yes, it can be done. Yes, you can do that. I have been to sites when I was back at the federal government. I went to some federal sites where you had a site facility person that was very aggressive and understood what they wanted to do. And they were able to reduce their consumption by 10, 20, 30%. One of them was 64%. I couldn't believe this person did so many things to reduce their energy consumption. That's certainly possible to do. But it takes time, it takes effort, and it's something that many of them don't have. But yeah, you can do that. You can try to pre-clean it up if you want to. I will tell you, though, that does take away some opportunity for savings that the ESCO could use to fund improvements in the facility. So you have to kind of weigh what you want to try to do and how you want to go about doing that. But yes, you could go through and do an extra work up front and clean up your baseline. It's very possible.
Okay. Question here from Joseph. Tim, he said you mentioned that earlier that every state has obviously their different incentives and criteria regarding ESPCs. Have you found any states that are considered very good to work with versus very bad? And he's asking about his home state of Maryland.
Well, I know the people that run Maryland, so I'm not going to say anything about Maryland because I don't want to have any repercussions there. But each state has its pluses and minuses, and I'm not going to give you the answer that you want. You'd like me to give you the top 5 states to work in and the bottom 5 states to work in, but I'm not going to do that. I probably have that list in my head somewhere. But in each of these states, I was surprised we had some work done in a state that I thought probably had little performance contracting happening in it. But yet when a problem arose, there were a lot of people that were very interested in solving the problem. And it told me that even in a state where I thought there was little happening, there's a lot happening. And so I will tell you, each state takes its own strategy. Some are more difficult and easier than others, but once you understand the strategy of how to make it work, then the state tends to work for you. Maryland certainly has projects done. I've done projects in Maryland back when I was in ESCO over almost 15 years ago. I did projects in the state of Maryland. They were very successful projects, and I think they're still doing projects today.
Yep, 2 more questions here, I think, Tim, and we'll be ready. One question was asking just popularity of ESCOs in the Caribbean area. Do you see a lot of movement and growth there?
I have heard about a lot of projects in the Caribbean, oddly enough. I don't know stats to know if there's a lot of growth there, but I have heard of a lot of projects happening. The federal government has done projects in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and I know we did one project on the U.S. Virgin Islands where we were able to save 100% of their energy use through installing solar panels. And for those islands, many times their power is generated by diesel generators, and it's a very expensive process to get the fuel there and to run the generators. And it's also a very polluting process. So there's a lot of opportunity because the electricity is very expensive. You can do a lot in high cost states like the Caribbean. California is a high cost state. New York can have high rates. And so I have heard of a lot of work happening in the Caribbean, yes, but okay. I don't have stats to back that up.
Sure. One last question here from the audience, and then maybe hand it over to you for some final thoughts, Tim. Amy was just wondering about some of those references that you mentioned earlier, and wondering if there was a spot on the NAESCO site where they might be able to find some of those sites, like recommendations of just places to look at, resources to look at, to look further into the ESCO concept.
Well, so you can go to our site, and there's some references on our site, but place to probably find out more of those references is the Energy Services Coalition. You spelled out Energy Services Coalition, all one word, .org, and they have a lot of references. And then if you do a Google search of DOE for Department of Energy space ESPC, you'll find a lot of information just by following those links as well. That's my best recommendation for you without being able to type in a reference here for you or something to scan right now. Those 2 things work for me quite often.
Okay. Yeah, and as we mentioned too, we also have in the related content area a link to the NAESCO website and also a couple articles that we've written on FacilitiesNet about the ESCO relationship. And hopefully you can read some of those. And we also have a number of other articles on our website as well. If you just search in ESCO or NAESCO or anything like that, and you'll find a treasure trove of pieces there. So finally, I guess that's all we had time for questions. But before we let everyone go today, Tim, did you have any kind of final thoughts or takeaways that you wanted to leave the audience with?
Well, yeah, when I started in the industry, I didn't fully understand performance contracts, and I didn't understand how the ESCOs work. And as I worked in the industry, I saw only the perspective of my company, and I saw us trying to work very hard to keep those clients happy for many, many years. Now that I'm outside and I see the whole industry, I really recognize that the ESCO industry is very unique in its desire to make sure that the projects are satisfactory to the client, simply because of that entire circle of the reference process. If you're thinking about working with an ESCO, or you think you might have a project, I encourage you to reach out to one of the companies on our website and just talk to them. There's no obligation. They'll typically even do a short walkthrough of your site to give you a picture of what might be there, and there's still no obligation. But make that initial contact and just to see what's out there. You can try to do that yourself and do that piece, but you're often very busy. You may not have the resources for it, and you might be surprised what an outsider can come in and find in just a 1 or 2 hour walkthrough of your site. So make the first step and reach out.
Great. Well, thank Tim. Thank you for all the information today. Thanks for being here. Our audience, thank you for sticking through the technical issues. I think we got some really good information from Tim through this, and hopefully you learned a little more about the process. So a reminder again, an archive of this event will be viewable on facilitiesnet.com/webcasts. You can take a check there. And again, to earn your CEUs, just download your certificate at the completion here and in the Earn Certification module. Tim, again, thank you for joining us. Hope you have a good afternoon and the rest of your day. And everybody else, thanks again for joining us. And that'll conclude today's webcast.